Hey guys, this is video number 5 for chapter 33, and this one is on the legacies of imperialism. Basically the impact that it had all over the world. And it was very, very significant. Imperialism and colonialism had huge impacts on the development of numerous regions throughout the world. In some cases, it was somewhat positive. It led to strengthening of relationships and certainly cultural diffusion, but a lot of it was negative. It brought conflict, it brought systemic racism, and a lot of that stuff still exists to this day. First, let's look at imperialism and economics. Now, economic motives were probably the biggest in driving industrialized nations to conquer new territories. These conquered lands then had new economic conditions forced upon them, usually resulting in trade imbalances. Colonies were exploited for their resources, whether it was gold, whether it was rubber, whether it was manpower, cash crops like sugar and cotton and so forth. That was the main focus for the imperial powers. They weren't there, this whole kind of, white man's burden, civilizing notion. That was completely secondary if it was a priority at all. First and foremost, they were there for money. And imperial nations were not interested in an even trade relationship. The advantages of trade went almost entirely to the imperialist nations. And that was 100% of the time. Sometimes colonial rule did result in economic changes. For instance, cotton cultivation. That began in India about 7,000 years ago, but it was always for domestic production. This completely shifted under British rule, so it was now entirely for export as opposed to local cloth making. It changed how cotton was picked, the amount of it, and then certainly what happened to it afterwards. The focus on export, it also led to an expansion of the railroads needed to transport cotton quickly. Here you see pictures of, in the late 1800s of, these cotton getting ready to be shipped out for production. That cotton was not being used in homespun anymore. That was being used to ship to back to England so that it could be used for cheap textiles in British factories and then be sold at cheaper prices back in India and totally pull the rug out from any type of Indian textile industry that was going on. Sometimes even new crops would be introduced that would radically shift a country, such as when Ceylon, which is today Sri Lanka, the British introduced tea. They forced them to focus on tea production. It wasn't even native to the island. Colonialism also led to widespread migration. Some of the movement was European migration. Now, you look at the map. Let me move me over here. This is the British Empire in the 1920s. And I remember the old saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And it was absolutely true. Okay, you had, in the Caribbean, Canada, you had even British Guyana in South America, you had large areas of Africa, you had the British Isles, you had Iraq, Palestine, India, Indonesia, Australia, and so forth. Okay, thousands and thousands of miles. Europeans, at times would leave their home to live in countries overseas. Now, this wasn't always because of imperialism. Between 1800 and 1914, around 50 million Europeans left for opportunities overseas, and most of these were going this way to the U.S. Actually, let me change something here. Change this to... I can't. All right, so... There we go. That's better. So now you can see it a little bit more. So most of this was to the United States, whether it was Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants, Polish, Russian immigrants, and so forth. But you also had a lot that went to settler colonies. All right. So you had a lot. Let me go this here. Do this as pen. So you had a lot that were going to places like South Africa, right? You had a lot that were going to places like Australia. You had a lot that were going to places like New Zealand. And these were mostly for agricultural prospects. Almost all of these migrants, though, they went as free laborers, as opposed to those coming from Africa and Asia. Many of these were indentured laborers. Now indentured laborers are you're working off a debt or some form of contract. Slavery was in decline by the mid-1800s all over the world, but planters in tropical climates still needed large numbers of workers. Indentured servants from the developing world supplied this workforce. Now, the majority actually came from India. All right, you did have some from China and even Japan and Africa and the Middle East, but India actually sent more than any other ones. The legacy of this can be seen in the large Indian populations in coastal cities of South Africa. All right, a lot of them, they came down here to work on cotton plantations and so forth in South Africa. And you can still see this, today in cities like Durban along the coast, all right, that still has large Indian populations. Now, all of these were examples of imperial migration. These movements were possible because of empire. British moved to Australia because Britain conquered Australia. Indians moved to South Africa because they were all part of the British Empire. So throughout all of this, whether you were going to Canada, or whether you're going to Uganda or India or Australia, it was all facilitated because they were all supposedly part of the British Empire under the British Crown. Now, a bit about empire and society. Empires often force people of different cultures and ethnicities to interact with each other on a regular basis. And I'm not just talking about the colonizer and subject peoples. I'm also talking about the diverse subject peoples themselves. This often led to colonial conflict. Now, colonial conflict took two main forms. The first was rebellion against imperial rule, the Sepoy Rebellion, which we talked about previously. That's the prime example of how imperialist indifference to local customs could lead to conflict. But it's far from the only example. Regardless of what Europeans believed or the kind of propaganda they spread, the colonies did not want to be colonies. They didn't want to be conquered. They resisted. They resisted often, and they resisted violently. Subject people were often at a disadvantage in terms of technology and weapons, so even if they didn't fight, they would often boycott or seek political resistance. The other kind of colonial conflict is conquered versus conquered. Conquered peoples fighting amongst themselves. Empires forced people who spoke different languages, worshiped different gods, sometimes didn't even get along, to all of a sudden be under the same flag. Look at Kenya, for instance. You look at the different ethnic groups. Now, this was part of the British Empire, and the British Empire decided that this is all going to be Kenya. Well, all of these people, if you went back centuries, they weren't part of the same nation. They didn't speak the same language. They didn't have that many similarities. Now they're told that they all have to be good British citizens. It didn't work out all the time. Sometimes it was because of labor migration issues also. You had numerous conflicts in Hawaii. You had migrant workers from China, Japan, the Philippines, along with native Hawaiian laborers. They didn't all get along. Now, another prominent but largely negative aspect of colonialism is scientific racism. Race eventually became an indicator of civilization. Despite the fact that there really is no such thing as a biologically pure race, scientists grouped humans into several categories of race and assigned each one specific attributes that were not only physical but also cultural and behavioral. Right? So here there are four main races that they split everybody into. You had white, Caucasian, you had black, Negroid, you had what they call Mongolian, which is a very obviously politically incorrect or an outdated word for Asian, and then you also had Native American as well. And they gave each group, kind of attributes that today we would call stereotypes. Africans were characterized as unintelligent and lazy. Asians were smart, but they were submissive. Europeans were noble and intelligent, and so forth. And you can clearly see the legacy of these views in white supremacist group today that still firmly believe in that stuff. Now, another corruption of this science. Oh, also, you see how it became a part of evolution. Right, how, they did biological studies on this stuff. You see how, the European features were the most quote unquote evolved and so forth. Now, social Darwinism, right? Let's talk about this guy, Charles Darwin, kind of get into stuff with evolution. Darwin was a British biologist who was the first to formalize the theory of evolution. He also believed that evolution was a survival of the fittest and that species best suited to survive do so, and those that aren't will die off. Okay. This was applied to race and society, unfortunately. So the notion of evolution, right, the notion of biological differences that you see here on these three faces, how it's basically a spectrum of evolution where you've got chimpanzee to ape, and then you've got the European model, your classic Greek-Roman model up top, and then who's in the middle, almost kind of, painting it out to be the missing link, but you've got the African feature there. This was bought into by a lot of people. Certain races were better fit and therefore evolved faster than others. This made technology and civilization a metaphor for racial evolution, which inevitably led to racist ideologies about which races are superior or inferior. It also justified European imperialism. Now, science wasn't a necessity for religion, though. Popular racism existed back then the same way that it exists today. This wasn't just about being more advanced. Europeans believed themselves to be morally better than non-whites, and it wasn't just for Europeans. All industrialized imperial nations engaged in racist attitudes, including Japan and the United States. For example, President McKinley, famous locally for being assassinated in Buffalo, he believed that the U.S. should civilize and Christianize the Philippines, the big part of the white man's burden. Now, anti-colonial movements. Nationalism is a part of this as well. Now, as I said before, conquered peoples didn't want to stay conquered, and many resisted, and much of this resistance was based on nationalist movements. Much like the way Napoleon spread nationalism in European lands he conquered, nationalist movements sprung up all throughout European empires, India especially. Indian nationalism in the 19th century was led by this guy, Ram Mohan Roy. He was an educated elite from the Bengali region in East India and did not call for a total rejection of all British influence. He recognized that there were some positives, such as an ending of sati and improving the status of women, but he also encouraged Hindus to hold themselves as equals to Christians. He encouraged Hindus to be educated and to work at social reform. His efforts inspired numerous reform groups throughout the 19th century, the most important being the INC, the Indian National Congress. It was founded in 1885. With British approval, interestingly enough, as a forum for educated Indians to voice their issues with colonial authorities. Representatives were from all over the subcontinent, and it started to focus more on issues of poverty, on taxes, and also of relief efforts, which the British were woefully inept at, with famine and drought and disease and things like that. By the early 20th century, though, it started to call for this thing called home rule, which wasn't a total breakaway from the empire, but just feeling that Indians should be able to rule their own land. And in 1916, it joined with the Muslim League, giving a unified voice for India to have more control in its own country. All right, so that wraps things up for this one, and as well for imperialism. Now, the next chapter, we're going to be getting into World War I, but it's important to understand the legacies of imperialism and also industrialization and leading into these massive, massive conflicts of the 20th century.